A racist and corrupt police officer tried to arrest a black woman inside the courtroom, right in front of the judge, lawyers, and a full gallery of witnesses. Not because she was a threat, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she dared to walk into that space with her head held high, confident, composed, and completely unapologetic about who she was. She didn't flinch when he stepped in her way. She didn't lower her voice when he barked orders. And that was enough to trigger his need for control. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about justice. It was about power. About reminding her, in his twisted perception, of her place. But the moment he reached for his handcuffs, was the moment everything changed. She had only come to the courtroom to deliver documents, high-level intelligence briefings for a federal case, but before she could even check in, the officer blocked her path. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering with an air of suspicion, a judgment he didn't try to hide. He asked no questions. He didn't ask for ID. He simply looked her over and decided she didn't belong. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "This area is restricted. You people think you can just walk in wherever you want, huh?" She looked around. The courtroom was silent. Eyes turned. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even the security guard by the metal detector. She calmly replied, "I'm just here to deliver these documents. I have clearance." His voice sharpened instantly. "You got clearance? You got clearance to be in my courtroom? Lady, I should cuff you right now just for lying to a federal officer." She stayed still, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The room watched, some with discomfort, some with hidden pleasure, others with complete indifference. That's the part that hurt the most, the indifference. Not the racist officer, not his humiliation tactics, but the silence from those who saw and chose to do nothing. He grabbed her arm and began to pull her toward the exit, saying something about trespassing, resisting authority, needing to teach people like her a lesson. And that's when she did it. She reached inside her coat. Slowly. Deliberately. And pulled out a small, black leather wallet. She flipped it open with one hand and held it up to his face. A badge gleamed under the courtroom lights. The letters were unmistakable. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Everything stopped. His grip loosened instantly. The veins in his neck pulsed. The judge leaned forward. A murmur rose in the gallery. The officer took a step back, confusion in his eyes, trying to understand what was happening, trying to undo the damage in his mind before it spiraled. But it was too late. She wasn't just an agent. She wasn't just someone with clearance. She was the Deputy Director of Operations for the CIA, the second highest intelligence officer in the entire agency. The documents she was carrying were classified and critical, not only to national security but to a case that would expose layers of corruption in law enforcement, layers she had spent years unraveling. What the officer didn't know, was that he was already on that list. And this wasn't just a coincidence. This was an opportunity. A test. And he failed. Miserably. The courtroom didn't know whether to speak, apologize, or run. The silence was louder than any siren. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. His badge number was already in her head. His personnel file had already been reviewed. His record, his disciplinary actions, the complaints filed against him, the internal investigations swept under the rug, all of it was already in her possession. She had come there with documents that would change lives. But in a moment of racist aggression, he handed her everything she needed to change his. And the worst part? She wasn't even surprised. This wasn't the first time. And he wasn't the first man. In fact, this case, the one the courtroom was about to begin hearing, was rooted in a years-long investigation into systemic abuse of power in law enforcement. Officers like him. Departments like his. Communities like the one she came from that had been ignored, brutalized, and silenced. But today, justice had a face. And it looked just like hers. Still, despite the badge, despite the authority, the damage was already done. She had been humiliated. Not because she lacked power. But because people like him assumed she didn't have any. Because of the color of her skin. Because of her silence. Because she didn't walk in with a weapon drawn. Because she believed, naively, perhaps, that respect would be met with respect. But now. Now the entire courtroom knew exactly who she was. And the man who tried to drag her out like a criminal, now stood on trial without even knowing it. He wasn't just wrong. He was exposed. Live. On record. In front of his peers. In front of the judge. In front of every spectator who had remained silent just moments before. And what came next, shook the entire system. Because what no one realized, what no one even thought to consider, was that the woman they tried to erase was the same woman who held the fate of that courtroom in her hands. Every detail. Every name. Every piece of paper. It all traced back to one operation. And she was leading it. But the real question is, if this was only the beginning, what else did she come here to reveal? And what did the officer really have to lose? You might think you've heard stories like this before. But not this one. Stay with us. The truth hasn't even begun to unfold. To every black viewer watching this right now, this story is for you. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Your life, your voice, and your presence matter, always. This channel is a space of empowerment, where truth is spoken, and justice finds its way, even in fiction. If you're here, know you're seen, you're valued, and you're not alone. Now, get ready for a powerful ride. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if you're ready for a story that hits deep. Enjoy the twist. The morning sunlight filtered through the dense skyline of Baltimore, bouncing off the windows of the downtown courthouse like fragmented glass. Outside, life moved in its usual rhythm, cars honked at double-parked trucks, pigeons fluttered above street vendors, and lawyers in dark suits rushed across the courthouse steps with portfolios clutched to their sides. But inside the grand federal building, where polished marble floors reflected fluorescent lights and old portraits of retired judges lined the wood-paneled walls, something heavier lingered in the air. A quiet tension. The kind you don't see, but feel. And on that particular morning, that tension had a name, Agent Nia Lawson. Nia wasn't the kind of person who needed to raise her voice to command a room. She never had been. At 38, she'd already lived through enough headlines and high-risk operations to silence even the loudest critics, but she wore her authority like a second skin, natural, precise, and unmistakably earned. She didn't flaunt it, never needed to. Her posture, her eyes, the way she moved, it all said the same thing: she belonged wherever she stood. That day, she arrived wearing a tailored black coat over a navy blue suit, simple heels, and her badge tucked in an inner pocket. Nothing extravagant. Nothing flashy. Just a woman on a mission, with documents tucked under her arm that could shift the outcome of a multi-agency investigation. She grew up not far from where she now worked, on the west side of Baltimore, in a neighborhood that had seen more yellow tape and eviction notices than it ever saw city funding. Her mother was a nurse, her father a construction worker. They taught her the value of resilience, not with speeches, but with action. Every time the lights got cut, every time the fridge sat empty for too long, every time her mother came home after a double shift with aching feet and a half-smile, Nia watched and learned. She learned that survival was a skill, and excellence was the only armor that could cut through expectations set far too low. By the time she reached high school, she was already tutoring classmates in biology and applying for college prep programs no one else in her class had even heard of. She didn't get a lot of encouragement back then. Teachers called her too intense, too serious, even too ambitious. And yet, She graduated top of her class, then headed straight into Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. That's where the CIA spotted her. Her professors said she was brilliant, meticulous, and unshakable. But it wasn't just her intellect that got her noticed, it was her ability to read people, to see not just what was said but what was unsaid. She knew how systems worked, and more importantly, she knew how to spot where they were broken. After 15 years in the agency, she rose through the ranks, becoming one of the youngest women, and one of the very few black women, to serve as Deputy Director of Operations. Her specialty wasn't just intelligence gathering. It was rooting out corruption. The kind that eats institutions from the inside. The kind that wears a badge and carries a gavel. And lately, her attention had turned to law enforcement, specifically, departments with long histories of racial profiling and abuse of power. She'd seen too many stories, too many names, too many mothers crying in hallways. It was no longer enough to collect data. She needed action. That's what brought her to the Baltimore courthouse that morning, not as a participant, not as a witness, but as a delivery agent. The documents in her hand were part of a federal review of several ongoing investigations into rogue officers who had long slipped through the cracks of internal affairs. The case that morning wasn't directly about her, but it involved a suspect tied to one of those officers, and the papers she carried would connect several dots the local police had failed or refused to connect themselves. As she entered the courthouse, her mind was focused, calculating. She passed through security, nodded to the clerk at the front desk, and headed toward the third-floor courtroom where she was instructed to deliver the envelope. She didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. She didn't expect kindness or recognition, just professional protocol. But what she got instead was something all too familiar: resistance. Standing outside the courtroom was Officer Thomas Granger, a man built like a linebacker with a crew cut and a jaw that never seemed to unclench. He was mid-40s, loud, confident, and comfortable in the authority his uniform gave him. His reputation inside the courthouse was a mix of respect and fear. He was known to be efficient, but his disciplinary file told another story, one marked by accusations of aggressive conduct and racial bias, though none had ever stuck. He was good at covering his tracks. Or rather, the system was good at covering them for him. When Nia approached the courtroom door, Granger looked her up and down with immediate skepticism. She offered a polite nod, intending to move past without delay, but he stepped in front of her, holding out a hand. "You lost, ma'am. This area's off limits unless you're part of the hearing." His voice was flat, but his eyes carried an edge, one sharpened by assumption. "I'm here to deliver something for the judge," Nia replied calmly, gesturing toward the envelope in her hands. Granger didn't move. "Let me see your ID." She hesitated for a moment, not because she didn't want to comply, but because his tone made it clear this wasn't about protocol. He hadn't asked for ID from the 3 white attorneys who entered just before her. He hadn't stopped the intern who nearly spilled coffee down the hallway. But her. He couldn't let her pass without a test. And he didn't hide that. She reached into her coat, but before she could pull anything out, his voice cut sharper. "Actually, you know what? Why don't you step back? You're not going anywhere until we figure out what you're really doing here." Heads turned. A couple of clerks slowed their walk. Nia straightened her posture. "I don't think that's necessary, officer." His eyes narrowed. "Are you talking back to me?" At that point, several more people had gathered at a distance, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The silence said everything. The discomfort was thick, but no one dared break protocol. Granger moved closer, now standing almost chest to chest with her, blocking the door entirely. "Either you step back now, or I'll detain you for obstruction," he said. "Last warning." She inhaled slowly, pulse steady. She'd seen this play out 100 times before, with teenagers in parking lots, with fathers stopped on their way home from work, with women forced to explain their existence before being allowed to breathe. It never got easier. And no matter how high she rose, moments like this reminded her that to people like Granger, her presence was still a provocation. She didn't move. Not yet. But in that moment, as his hand brushed toward the cuffs on his belt, she knew something he didn't. He was about to cross a line that would change his life forever. Not because she would resist. Not because she would fight back. But because justice doesn't always come with flashing lights and handcuffs. Sometimes it comes dressed in silence, with eyes that see everything and say nothing, until the moment is right. And that moment was coming. Very soon. The silence that followed Officer Granger's threat was thick with anticipation, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Nia didn't flinch, didn't back down, but inside her chest, her heart tapped with that familiar rhythm, anger restrained by control. She didn't react, because she couldn't afford to. She knew what they expected. She knew the moment she raised her voice or challenged him too directly, the narrative would flip. The aggressive black woman. The insubordinate troublemaker. The one who should have known better. But she also knew that sometimes power isn't shown by pushing forward, it's revealed by standing still. As his hand hovered near his belt, ready to escalate a moment that never should have happened, the courtroom doors behind him creaked open. A young female clerk peeked out, scanning the hallway with furrowed brows before her eyes landed on the scene. Her voice was sharp, almost panicked as she stepped out and addressed Granger, asking what the problem was. He turned his head slightly but didn't move his body. "Security issue," he grunted, still blocking the door. The clerk looked at Nia, confused, and then recognition hit her eyes. She moved quickly, whispering something into Granger's ear, but whatever it was, his expression didn't change. His pride wouldn't let go. His fingers clenched tighter, not just around the situation, but around his need to win, to dominate, to be right. The clerk disappeared back into the courtroom, her face pale, and Granger leaned in closer. "You really thought you could just walk in here like you own the place?" he muttered, just low enough for her to hear, but his breath was sharp, full of venom. "I don't care what kind of messenger you think you are. Around here, you follow my rules." Nia looked him dead in the eye, her voice low and steady. "I follow the law. You should try it sometime." That was the last straw for him. With no hesitation, he reached for her arm, fingers closing hard around her wrist as he barked out, "You're coming with me." Gasps echoed around the hallway. A security guard across the room began to move, but too late. The grip was already there, already too tight, and in one fluid motion, Nia reached into her coat with her free hand and calmly revealed her badge. He froze. For the first time in the entire encounter, his face registered something other than smug authority. It registered fear. Not because of who she was in that moment, but because of what she represented. She didn't say a word as she held it up. Let the silence speak for her. Let the room catch up to what had just happened. Slowly, Granger's hand dropped away from her wrist. He stepped back, blinking like he had just woken up from a dream that turned into a nightmare. The hallway was now fully alert, people whispering. The clerk reappeared, this time followed by the judge's bailiff, who looked from Nia to Granger and then back again with an expression that didn't need words. Granger was told to step aside. He didn't argue this time. Just nodded stiffly, face flushed, eyes cast downward. Nia walked past him without another look. Inside the courtroom, everything was in motion, lawyers flipping through files, the judge reviewing documents, a low buzz of procedural conversation. But the second she stepped into the room, it all shifted. People had already heard. News traveled fast in halls like these. The judge glanced up, and without missing a beat, said, "You must be the courier from Langley." His tone was formal, neutral, but behind his eyes, something shifted. Nia nodded, walking forward, handing over the envelope she had carried across state lines, sealed with a level of clearance that most people in the room would never even glimpse. The judge accepted the documents and gave a subtle nod of appreciation, but the tension still hovered. She didn't stay. That wasn't her role, not today. But as she turned to leave, she felt the gaze of half the room fixed on her back, watching, whispering, wondering. Outside the courtroom, Granger was gone. Reassigned to another floor, someone muttered. Others said he had asked to step away for the rest of the day. But Nia knew better. He wasn't taking a break. He was processing. Not just the humiliation of being wrong in front of his peers, but the realization that he had targeted someone far more powerful than he imagined. Someone who saw him. Who had the reach to make things inconvenient for him. And she would. But not yet. That evening, back at her office, Nia sat in silence staring at her screen. The folder labeled Operation Obsidian glowed faintly in the corner of the desktop. Dozens of tabs. Hundreds of pages. Names. Dates. Complaints. Body cam footage. Memos that were supposed to be buried. And right there, among them, the familiar name, Officer Thomas Granger. Not just for what happened that morning, but for at least 6 other incidents, unfiled charges, redacted reports, mysteriously closed cases. She had seen the pattern before. A predator in uniform protected by the machinery of bureaucracy. He wasn't just a problem. He was a symptom. Her phone buzzed. A message from her director. Did he take the bait? Nia smiled faintly. The plan had worked better than expected. What no one knew, not Granger, not the clerks, not even the judge, was that her presence that day hadn't been random. That envelope she carried? It was real. The documents inside? Authentic. But the delivery? Orchestrated. Staged. Her appearance in that courthouse was part of a broader test. A provocation. To see how certain individuals would react when confronted with a black woman in a position of assumed vulnerability. And Granger had delivered, exactly as predicted. But this wasn't just about one man's fall. It was about something larger, structural, deeply embedded, and long overdue for reckoning. She wasn't hunting monsters. She was unmasking them. And her team had built a web tight enough that this time, no one would escape. But something still didn't sit right. There was a file missing. A report that should have arrived from the internal database had been delayed. Granger's personnel file was incomplete. Sections marked under review or pending clearance. That wasn't standard. Someone was blocking something. Redacting things they didn't want the agency to see. Nia picked up the phone, dialing a contact inside the DOJ. The call was brief but heavy. "Did you find it?" she asked. A pause. "Not yet. But you were right. He's connected to something bigger. A task force. Private contracts. Unmarked payments. We're still digging." She hung up, the storm building behind her eyes. The humiliation from earlier hadn't broken her. It had confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't about one courtroom, one badge, one outburst of racism. It was about an entire system fighting to stay hidden. And she was about to turn on the lights. But what she didn't know yet was that someone inside the agency was watching her. Someone with power. And secrets. And a reason to keep Granger's name buried. She thought she had all the pieces. But she was missing one. And that piece would change everything. Rain tapped softly against the windowpane of the high-rise CIA briefing room as the clock neared midnight. The lights inside were dimmed low, a subtle hush filling the space. Nia stood alone near the long glass table, her fingers sliding over the edge of the dossier folder she'd just reviewed for the 3rd time. Her jaw clenched. Inside the file was everything they had on Granger, and still, it wasn't enough. Pieces were missing. Transfers unlogged. Complaints filed and retracted with no explanation. He'd been shielded, yes, but by whom? That was the question burning in her mind. And it wasn't just an itch anymore. It was a warning. Someone in her own house was pulling strings to keep him clean. Her eyes scanned the final page again, and then, slowly, she closed the file and walked to the adjoining hallway, the sound of her heels echoing against the tiled floor. Down 2 floors, tucked in a secure division, the Internal Threats Unit had been operating in tandem with her team on Operation Obsidian. They didn't know the full scope, just enough to run what they believed was a standard audit of federal contractors with potential connections to extremist organizations. But she knew now, this wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about abuse of power. There was money moving behind it. Quietly. Strategically. Certain officers, Granger among them, were being funneled into task forces through private funding. Some linked to defense corporations, others to urban security initiatives under federal grants. It was a network. Built to survive investigations. Built to protect itself. She stepped into the unit's secure room. Marcus, her most trusted analyst, was already there, eyes heavy from lack of sleep, but hands moving fast over the keyboard. He didn't need to look up to speak. "I found something." A suppressed report from the DOJ's Ethics Division. It was flagged as irrelevant and buried under routine filings, he said as his screen lit up with the header, Interagency Misconduct Brief, Confidential. Nia moved closer, reading as the lines revealed themselves. Payments from a private intelligence consulting firm to various police departments, Baltimore included. Officers identified as on-ground enforcers, trained to agitate during protests, falsify charges, stir up racial tension to justify increases in security funding. Granger's name was there. Not once. Multiple times. He wasn't just a rogue cop. He was on payroll. And the company writing those checks used to be a CIA front, decommissioned a decade ago, or so they thought. She took a breath. The chill hit her spine slowly. She wasn't just looking at corruption. She was looking at something far more dangerous, an entire ecosystem fed by manufactured chaos. And it was crawling back into the government through a door someone had left open. Suddenly, the door behind her buzzed. It was Director Samuel Royce. He wasn't supposed to be in the building. Not at that hour. Not without notice. He stepped in quietly, his presence heavy, his eyes scanning the room with that usual cold detachment. Royce had mentored her early in her career. He taught her to trust the facts, not her feelings. He taught her that justice in intelligence was methodical, not emotional. And now, as he stepped closer, the silence between them carried more weight than any file on the desk. "I thought you might be here," he said. His tone was low, almost unreadable. Nia didn't turn. "You signed off on Granger's field evaluations." 3 of them. That's how he stayed off the radar. He stepped forward. "I signed off on hundreds of field evaluations." She finally turned to face him. "Not for people connected to reactivated CIA assets. Not for officers taking payment from a shell company that's supposed to be dead." Royce's expression didn't change. "You've been digging too deep, Nia. You weren't assigned to internal affairs. You were supposed to assess municipal integration risks, not build a case against the agency itself." Her voice didn't waver. "You knew what he was. You knew exactly who he worked for. And you let him walk into that courtroom, armed with a badge and a history of violence, knowing he'd target someone like me." Royce sighed, stepped closer, and lowered his voice. "Do you really think this job is clean? That all our hands are spotless? We've done things in the name of security that you'll never read in any file. You think this country stays stable on ideals? No. It stays stable on controlled chaos. And sometimes we need men like Granger. Because they're predictable. And useful." Nia's stare didn't break. "You used me as bait." He said nothing. And in that nothing, the truth echoed louder than any confession. She took a step back, the nausea building beneath her ribs, not from shock, but from confirmation. The case hadn't been hers to build. It had been theirs to bury. And she was supposed to be the collateral. A calculated loss. A strategic provocation. Let the black agent walk into hostile ground, watch what happens, use the data to refine their control. It was manipulation at the deepest level. Marcus finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't strategy. This is betrayal." Royce looked at him calmly. "This is national security." Nia exhaled slowly. "No. This is self-preservation. And it ends now." She turned back to the table, retrieved the drive Marcus had prepared, and held it up. "This is every file. Every name. Every contract. You can threaten to shut it down, but it's already scheduled to go public in 72 hours. 3 different safe drops. 1 to the Senate Oversight Committee. 1 to the press. 1 to the International Intelligence Alliance." Royce didn't blink. "You'd betray your own agency?" Her voice was steady. "You already did." Silence. Then Royce gave a faint, bitter smile. "You'll make enemies." She nodded. "Good. That means I'm aiming in the right direction." He turned and left without another word, the door closing behind him like the end of a chapter. But for Nia, it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what was about to unfold. The fallout would be brutal. The resistance, inevitable. But for the first time in her career, she wasn't protecting shadows. She was exposing them. And outside that building, somewhere in the city, Thomas Granger was unaware that by morning, his face would be on every screen in America. Not as a cop. Not as a patriot. But as a piece in a much darker puzzle that was finally being taken apart. And what the world would learn next, would change everything. The next morning, the sky over Baltimore was smeared in a palette of muted gray and slow-drifting fog, as if the city itself sensed the weight of what was coming. Across newsrooms, inboxes, and encrypted servers, the files began to hit. The first ping arrived at 7:04 a.m., a notification from a classified Senate server. Then another, 5 minutes later, at a top news outlet's confidential tip line. By 7:30, it was spreading like wildfire. Documents, payment logs, internal memos, all carrying the names of law enforcement officers across multiple states involved in covert domestic agitation networks. Nia's name was nowhere in the leak, but her fingerprints were all over it. Every connection had been made deliberately, every thread tied to the undeniable pattern that pointed back to a silent partnership between certain police departments and a ghost network of defense contractors still tied, unofficially, to the CIA. Inside the Baltimore courthouse, Thomas Granger walked in with his usual morning swagger, coffee in one hand, badge on his belt. The quiet stares didn't register at first. He was used to attention. But this morning was different. Faces weren't looking at him with fear or indifference. They were watching with suspicion. Whispers followed him down the hall. He passed a clerk who quickly turned away. Another officer met his eyes briefly, then lowered his gaze. Granger frowned, his steps slowing. He reached the main security desk, greeted the guard with a nod, but the man didn't answer. He just stared at the monitor in front of him. On it, a breaking news banner flashed in red. Granger leaned forward slightly, enough to see a familiar photo above the headline. His own. Baltimore officer named in explosive federal conspiracy leak. He blinked, staring in disbelief. The screen showed images of memos, signatures, a flowchart linking him to an organization he thought was buried deep enough to never surface again. He stepped back, muttering, "This is bulls," but the sentence died in his throat as a cold hand settled in his chest. Not fear. Rage. He turned and stormed down the hallway toward the elevator. He didn't even hear the metal detectors buzz as he pushed through the doors and slammed the button for the 3rd floor. Upstairs, the courtroom was already buzzing. Not with legal chatter, but with tension. The judge was late. The bailiff looked nervous. Lawyers huddled, whispering while refreshing their phones. Then the door opened and Nia walked in. Not in her usual delivery mode. She wasn't here to pass a file. She was here to witness the collapse of a wall she'd spent years trying to crack. She wore the same composed expression, but beneath it, her pulse was steady with purpose. Granger stepped in seconds after her. His eyes locked onto hers instantly, fire flickering behind them. He marched toward her, voice low but sharp. "You think this is a game? You think you can just leak classified intel and walk in here like nothing happened?" She didn't flinch. "You're finally being seen, Thomas. That's not an attack. That's accountability." He laughed bitterly, closer now, the veins in his neck visible. "You're finished. You went too far. You violated every protocol in the book." Her voice stayed calm, but every word cut deep. "There's a difference between breaking protocol and breaking the law. What I exposed wasn't protected. It was hidden. There's a difference." He stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a growl. "You ruined my life." She looked at him, eyes unblinking. "No. You did that yourself. I just made sure people finally saw it." The judge entered the room at that moment, tension breaking slightly as the court was called into session. But the shift had already happened. Everyone in that room had seen the confrontation. They had felt it. No one spoke it out loud, but the dynamic was no longer the same. Granger's authority had crumbled in front of them. Not with guns, not with violence, but with truth. Hours passed. Hearings resumed. But the focus kept drifting. Every time Granger moved, every time he stepped into view, the air grew heavy. Then, mid-afternoon, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from the precinct. Suspended until further review. Effective immediately. Surrender badge and weapon. He read it 3 times. His throat tightened. He stood frozen in the hallway, blinking at the screen, as if staring hard enough could make it disappear. Nia walked past him again, slow and silent, but this time, he didn't follow. He didn't speak. He just stood there. Later that night, she stood on the rooftop of her building, city lights flickering below her. Marcus joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing her one without a word. They both stared out at the skyline, silent for a long time. Then he asked, "You think this really changes anything?" She took a slow sip before answering. "Not everything. But it changes something. It chips away at the belief that no one's watching. That they can do what they want and silence anyone who sees." He nodded, thoughtful. "They'll come for you. You know that." "I know," she said. "But I'm not hiding anymore." And then, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. One message. "You're not done." She stared at it, reading it over and over. Not with fear, but with understanding. This wasn't the end. This was the next move in a much larger game. And the rules? She would be the one writing them now. The following days unfolded like the slow turn of a blade, precise, painful, irreversible. Baltimore no longer looked the same, not to Nia. It wasn't the buildings or the skyline that had changed, but the way people moved, the way conversations hushed when she entered a room, the way her name hung in the air like something too charged to speak aloud. She had stepped beyond the boundary of what even the agency considered manageable. Not rogue, but too bold, too visible. The files she had released hadn't just embarrassed departments and exposed corruption. They had destabilized structures that thrived in the shadows. She had pulled the curtain back and, in doing so, lit a fire no one could ignore. And yet, there was no victory lap. No press conference. No badge of honor. There was only silence, and scrutiny. Inside Langley, the atmosphere had turned cold. Nia noticed it in the way emails slowed to a trickle, how hallway conversations stopped the moment she passed, how her requests suddenly required multiple levels of approval that hadn't existed before. The agency was distancing itself from her, not because they didn't believe what she had exposed, but because they couldn't afford to stand beside her publicly. She had forced them into a corner where they had to choose between loyalty to truth or allegiance to institutional power. And power, she knew too well, almost always protects itself. At the same time, public pressure outside the walls was escalating. The names leaked in the documents were under review, but reviews were slow and politicized. Some departments denied everything, claiming forged memos and biased interpretations. Others launched internal investigations designed more to delay than to resolve. Nia sat in meeting after meeting, watching layers of red tape be applied over undeniable facts. The energy she had once felt, righteous, focused, unstoppable, began to flicker under the weight of bureaucracy and silent retaliation. Marcus remained her only real ally inside. He kept digging, kept sending her updates through secure channels, though even he had begun to express concern about the reach of what they were unraveling. One night, as they met in the dim light of an empty cafe on the edge of the city, he slid a flash drive across the table with a troubled look. I traced 2 more contract routes. One of them links to a sitting senator. The money flows through nonprofits, media firms, even tech startups. If we publish this, it's not just dirty cops. It's national leadership. She stared at the drive, not touching it, her hand resting beside her coffee. There was a silence between them that stretched longer than either intended. He finally said, "You sure you want to take it that far?" Her response came slowly, like it had been forming inside her long before the question was asked. "If we stop here, they'll win. They'll rewrite the story. They'll make me the threat, make you the traitor, bury the files, rebrand the contractors, and keep everything moving. The only way forward is through it." Marcus nodded, but the weight in his eyes lingered. "Then we better be ready for what's coming next. Because this isn't just about Granger anymore. This is about who decides what justice looks like in this country." The next morning, she found her office access revoked. No warning. No explanation. Just a frozen keycard and a confused security officer who mumbled that he was just following orders. Her belongings had been boxed and labeled for off-site review. It wasn't a firing. It was a message. A slow erasure. When she called HR, the line disconnected twice. When she finally reached someone, the response was robotic. "There's an active compliance audit regarding your recent activities. You'll be contacted once it's completed." But she knew what that meant. She was being sidelined. Isolated. Neutralized. Meanwhile, Granger had vanished from public view. After his suspension, he stopped reporting to work, his name erased from duty rosters, his home under quiet surveillance. Some said he had lawyered up. Others believed he had been offered a deal in exchange for silence. Nia had no confirmation, and every route she pursued to track his movements hit a wall. He was either being protected or silenced, and she didn't know which was worse. What haunted her most wasn't the man himself, but what he represented, a system that punished transparency more harshly than it ever punished brutality. One afternoon, while walking through Druid Hill Park to clear her head, her phone buzzed with a call from a number she hadn't seen in years. It was Marianne Vega, a former field agent turned whistleblower who had vanished after testifying against a covert operation gone wrong. Nia answered cautiously, stepping off the main path as she spoke. "Marianne." The voice on the other end was quick, low. "You stirred the hornet's nest. You've got less time than you think. They're not trying to silence you, they're trying to discredit you." Nia's grip tightened on the phone. "Why call me now?" "Because I've been where you are. They'll paint you as unstable. Leak your records. Question your judgment. By the time they're done, no one will remember the files. Just the headline, disgraced CIA official under investigation for misconduct. You have to get ahead of it." "How?" "Expose everything. Not just the network. Expose the agency's silence. Force their hand. Make them choose, transparency or collapse. Before Nia could respond, the line cut. She stood still for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees above her. For the first time since the leak, the weight on her chest wasn't just professional. It was personal. They weren't just trying to erase what she had done. They were trying to erase who she was. That night, she recorded a message, raw, direct, no script. Just her voice and her truth. She told the story from the beginning. Not just the leak, but the silence before it. The warnings she ignored. The people who helped her. The names she couldn't mention. And the reasons she refused to stand down. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for attention. For accountability. She uploaded it to a secure video channel and scheduled it to publish in 48 hours, unless manually stopped. A fail-safe. Just in case. Meanwhile, whispers inside the agency turned into murmurs outside. Journalists began to piece things together. Former agents reached out. Civil rights groups demanded answers. And somewhere in the background, someone was watching it all unfold, calculating, waiting. The tension wasn't just political. It was existential. If the truth survived this storm, it could reshape the national conversation. But if it didn't, Nia would become another cautionary tale. Another woman who flew too close to power and got burned. She stood now on the edge of something irreversible. She had choices, but none of them came without sacrifice. If she pushed further, she risked losing everything she had spent her life building. If she stepped back, she'd betray every victim the files represented. And in between stood the question that had haunted her since the beginning: how much truth is too much for a system built on silence? The final move was coming. But would the world be ready to hear what she still had left to say? It was nearing midnight when Nia found herself sitting in her apartment in complete darkness, the only source of light coming from the glow of her laptop screen. The city beyond the window was still alive, sirens in the distance, horns, the occasional echo of a voice calling into the night, but inside, there was a silence so consuming it felt almost protective. On the screen in front of her was the scheduled video, her face paused mid-sentence, mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on the lens with clarity and fire. The video was set to release automatically within 24 hours if not manually cancelled. A digital time bomb. A reckoning. She had recorded it as a shield, as proof that she had tried to tell the truth before they could rewrite it, distort it, bury it. But what weighed on her now wasn't fear, it was something else. The crushing question of whether telling the truth would actually change anything. Her phone lit up. A message from Marcus. Just a single line. They've started leaking your psych evals. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath slowing. She had seen it coming. Years ago, when she first climbed the ladder, there had been a notation in one of her internal reviews suggesting she was excessively vigilant and emotionally unyielding. At the time, she had brushed it off, coded language meant to soften the discomfort she caused in people not used to being challenged by someone like her. But now they were turning that into a weapon. A narrative. She knew how it would unfold. Claims that she was unstable. That her actions stemmed from personal vendettas. That she fabricated the leak to draw attention, to feed some psychological need for justice she could never fulfill. She'd seen it happen to others before. And now it was her turn. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus, her voice low but firm. We're out of time. They're not going to stop. We need to make the final drop. There was a long pause on the other end. Then he replied, his tone quieter than usual. Are you sure? Once we release the rest, there's no walking it back. This isn't just law enforcement. This touches cabinet-level names. Contractors connected to federal elections. National surveillance programs. This could shake the country. Nia stood, walking slowly to the window, looking out at the city like it was something fragile. That's why we have to do it. If we don't, they'll build a new lie and sell it as the truth. And if I stay silent, I become part of it. Marcus exhaled through the line. Okay. But once this goes live, they won't just come after your name. They'll come after your freedom. Maybe more. Nia didn't hesitate. I'm not afraid of losing something I already know how to rebuild. What I'm afraid of is waking up and realizing I let fear stop me from doing what needed to be done. They agreed on a final meeting. Off-grid. One of the old safe houses Nia had used years ago when she worked undercover in Central America. It was nothing more than a half-abandoned townhouse on the edge of the city, long forgotten by agency logistics. No surveillance. No data trails. Just cement walls and quiet. When she arrived, Marcus was already there, hunched over his laptop, dozens of drives and backups scattered across the wooden table. He looked up as she entered, exhaustion visible in the slump of his shoulders and the hollowness under his eyes. But he smiled, and in that moment, the bond between them felt heavier than the mission itself. They weren't just colleagues anymore. They were survivors of a war neither of them signed up for, but both refused to walk away from. Nia sat across from him, her voice low. What's the status? He turned the screen toward her. The full database is encrypted and ready. If we hit send now, it goes to 7 global outlets, 3 watchdog groups, and an independent archive in Iceland. Even if we get shut down, it'll keep spreading. She nodded, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small, black notebook. She placed it on the table between them. These are the last names. The ones I didn't upload. Too dangerous. Too high up. I wanted to wait. Make sure we had evidence solid enough to survive every attack. Marcus opened the notebook, scanning it. His eyes widened slightly. Jesus. These people, she cut him off gently. I know. That's why we don't just send this. We show it. We tie it to the footage. We release it with a face and a voice they can't ignore. He nodded. Yours. A pause. Then she whispered, mine. They worked through the night, assembling the final package. The video edits. The overlays. The time logs. They built it not just as a leak, but as a story, one with context, with evidence, with undeniable human cost. They didn't want rage. They wanted awareness. Understanding. They wanted people to see what had been done in their name while they looked away. As dawn crept in, Marcus turned to her, his voice almost breaking. If we make it through this, what happens to us? Nia looked at him, her gaze softening. We rebuild. We keep going. But even if we don't, we did something that mattered. That's more than most ever get. Suddenly, a loud knock shook the silence. They froze. Another knock. Firmer this time. Nia signaled Marcus to shut down the drive, grab the backups. She stepped toward the door slowly, silently pulling her badge from her waistband, not for access, but as a reminder of who she still was. When she opened the door, 2 figures stood outside. One she recognized immediately, Marianne Vega. The other, a man in plain clothes she didn't know, but his posture told her everything she needed. Ex-military. Possibly former intelligence. Dangerous. Marianne spoke first. They're coming. Not to arrest. To disappear. Nia's heart skipped. How much time? An hour. Maybe less. They've already tagged this building as a threat zone. They'll move fast. No legal procedure. No warning. Marcus appeared behind her, panic rising in his voice. We haven't sent it yet. Marianne pulled a drive from her coat. You don't need to. I have another line. Offshore. Fully protected. But we have to go now. Nia stared at her. Why are you helping? Marianne's voice cracked. Because I remember what it felt like when no one helped me. Nia turned to Marcus. Grab everything. We finish this in the car. They moved quickly. No words wasted. Every second mattered now. As they drove away from the townhouse, Nia looked back one last time. Not at the building, but at what it represented. Everything she had built, everything she had lost, everything she had decided was worth more than her safety. She turned forward again. The road was long. The city still dark. But the truth was already burning. And it was far too late to stop it now. The SUV tore down the side streets of northeast Baltimore, headlights off, engine running low to avoid drawing attention. Nia sat in the back, knees pressed together, hands gripping the sides of the seat as if she could hold the vehicle steady just by willing it. Marcus was beside her, his laptop open despite the car's movement, fingers flying across the keyboard as if the machine could feel the urgency they carried. Up front, Marianne drove with intensity in her eyes, cutting corners, glancing in the rearview mirror every 10 seconds. The man beside her hadn't spoken since they left. Nia still didn't know his name, but from the way he scanned intersections before they even reached them, she knew he was trained for this. Trained to move when the world started falling apart. The minutes stretched longer than time itself. Every stoplight felt like an ambush. Every pedestrian seemed like a planted spotter. The further they drove, the more the silence grew into something unbearable. It was Marcus who finally broke it, voice rough from lack of sleep. The backup routes are clean so far. But once this goes live, we'll lose any illusion of control. It's not going to be just the agency after us. There are too many people invested in keeping this buried. Nia didn't answer right away. Her mind was somewhere else. She kept thinking of her father. The first time she told him she wanted to work in intelligence, he hadn't blinked. He just looked at her and said, "Then be the kind of spy who tells the truth." It sounded naive then. But now? Now it felt like prophecy. She turned to Marcus, her voice quieter than she intended. "How much time do you need?" He looked at the screen. 10 minutes. Maybe 12. As soon as we hit the new satellite tunnel, I can initiate the trigger sequence. It'll bounce through 3 countries before the files even reach their final servers. If they try to trace it, they'll be chasing shadows. Marianne's voice came from the front seat. We've got one more route to cross. After that, there's no turning back. Once we breach federal firewalls, they'll classify this as cyber warfare. Nia's breath hitched slightly. Not out of fear, but out of the enormity of what that meant. She had never intended for things to escalate this far. Her job had always been about strategy, leverage, pressure from within. But this wasn't about diplomacy anymore. This was exposure. Raw and irreversible. She looked out the window at the buildings flashing by, the flicker of street lamps over shuttered storefronts, and for a brief second, she wondered how many people were sitting inside those apartments, living their lives unaware that a single upload could change how they saw their country. The car pulled off the main road and ducked behind an abandoned warehouse. Marianne cut the engine, turned in her seat. This is it. Once Marcus sends the files, we split up. You'll go with him to the fallback point in Philly. I'll draw attention west. Nia nodded, opening her door and stepping into the cold. The night air was sharp against her skin, the silence around them total. Marcus climbed out and followed her to the back of the warehouse where a single generator-powered table was set up, shielded from drone detection and monitored by a closed system that only Marianne's contact could access. He booted up the satellite relay, eyes scanning the lines of code that danced across the screen. We're almost there. Just a few more lines. Nia stood behind him, arms folded across her chest. She didn't speak, but her presence said everything. They had come too far. Seen too much. Lost too many pieces of themselves to stop now. Then Marcus paused. His hand hovered over the enter key. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. She looked down at him. "What?" "If we send this, and the system really does collapse, if careers fall, agencies are restructured, people disappear, will it have been worth it?" "Not for justice." "I know that answer. I mean for you. For your life." Nia felt the question like a weight pressing against her ribs. She looked at the screen, at the line waiting to be crossed, and spoke without hesitation. "I never expected justice to be easy. I just expected it to be real. If we don't do this, we're just letting them choose who matters and who doesn't. I can't live with that. Not anymore." He nodded, turned back, and hit the key. In an instant, the data leapt into motion. Strings of numbers flowed like rivers across the screen, bouncing through servers, switching protocols, replicating faster than fire. The video files. The documents. The testimonies. The contractor logs. The names. It all began to move. The truth was no longer just in their hands, it was everywhere. At the same time, a low rumble passed overhead. Nia looked up sharply. Aircraft. Not commercial. Silent. Fast. Unmarked. Marianne appeared at her side. "They know." The man with her, finally speaking for the first time, added, "They're coming in heavy. Not just federal. Private mercs. Black ops. They want you contained before sunrise." Marcus was still typing furiously. "I just need 3 more minutes to finish the spread. After that, even if they shut us down, it's too late." They ran. Back to the SUV. This time, no headlights. No hesitation. Every turn was tactical, every stop calculated. They left behind the old building, the generator still humming like a heartbeat. But Nia knew the real noise was just beginning. Inside the car, she pulled out her phone. Messages were already flooding in. From activists. From old colleagues. From reporters. Her name was trending in every corner of the internet. Some called her a traitor. Others called her a hero. She didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she opened her own video. The one scheduled to go live in 24 hours. And she cancelled the delay. She released it manually. Let them see her eyes. Let them hear her voice. Let them understand that she wasn't some rogue agent with a grudge. She was someone who had watched a system crush lives quietly for years and had finally decided it was time to make noise. The footage played immediately across global networks. In it, she spoke plainly. About the years she spent watching policies written in silence hurt people who would never know her name. About the officers like Granger who weren't anomalies, but templates. About the lawmakers who signed off on surveillance budgets and turned their backs when the abuse hit the headlines. And finally, about the choice she had made. To let the world decide what kind of truth they wanted to live with. By the time the video ended, emergency sessions were being called in D.C. Her face was on every screen. But she wasn't hiding. She was heading straight into the fire. In the days that followed the video release, the world didn't slow down, it exploded. Governments scrambled to make statements that sounded like action but tasted like fear. Agencies denied, deflected, disowned. Politicians scheduled press conferences with solemn faces and careful words. But what they didn't understand was that the impact wasn't in their response. The impact was in the people watching. For the first time, the public saw names, signatures, receipts. They didn't just hear accusations, they read proof. And that changed everything. Nia became more than a whistleblower. She became a symbol. Her name was etched into every headline, her voice pulled into every debate. Commentators dissected her every word, trying to figure out how one woman, alone, could bring an entire machine to its knees. But the truth was, she hadn't been alone. Behind her stood years of silence, and the echoes of every unheard cry for justice. She was the result of all of it. The culmination. And when her face filled the screens, the world couldn't look away. She didn't disappear. She didn't run. Instead, she walked directly into the public sphere, unarmed, unfiltered. At first, some tried to tear her apart. They launched investigations into her personal life, tried to paint her as unstable, obsessive, dangerous. But they underestimated the power of transparency. Everything they dug up, she had already spoken about. Every tactic they used had already been exposed by her own narrative. And that's what saved her, not just the evidence, but her honesty. It became unshakable. Eventually, pressure forced change. A federal inquiry was launched, not into Nia's actions, but into the network she had revealed. High-level resignations followed. A senator was indicted. Several private contractors were suspended pending criminal review. Granger's name resurfaced during the hearings, not as a scapegoat, but as a critical node in a web of dirty operations. Under pressure, his immunity deal was revoked. He was arrested during a routine check at a private airstrip, trying to board a plane with a false passport and unregistered cash. When questioned, he refused to speak. When tried, he was convicted on federal conspiracy charges and sentenced to 2 decades in a maximum security facility. His fall was public, humiliating, and complete. Marcus, once the silent force behind the operation, stepped into the light. With Nia's encouragement, he testified at a Senate hearing, explaining how internal systems had been manipulated to hide abuse. He was offered positions in several agencies after that, but turned them all down. He became a leading voice in digital ethics, helping build a new independent oversight council that would audit government surveillance contracts going forward. His choice not to join the very systems he helped expose made him a quiet hero. He didn't need applause. He just needed truth to stop hiding. Marianne Vega disappeared again, but this time by choice. She had done her part. She had carried the weight when others wouldn't. And now, she walked away, leaving only a note for Nia that read, "We were never meant to stay in the fire. Just long enough to burn what needed to end." Nia never heard from her again, but kept that note close. Folded neatly. Safe. As for Nia herself, her future was not what she expected, but it was more than she hoped for. She was cleared of all internal charges. An independent commission ruled that her actions were justified in the face of institutional failure. But the CIA, while officially acknowledging her integrity, quietly offered her a severance package and a gentle push toward retirement. She refused both. Instead, she stepped down on her own terms, with her record intact and her pride unshaken. What came next wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding. She founded a nonprofit called Unseen, dedicated to investigating systemic abuse and protecting whistleblowers within federal and local systems. The organization didn't just advocate, it trained, it defended, it fought in court. Within a year, Unseen helped overturn multiple wrongful convictions and exposed new misconduct in departments that had never faced oversight before. It became a beacon. And she became the light behind it. Her days no longer involved encrypted briefings or surveillance reports. They were filled with classrooms, strategy sessions, and long walks through neighborhoods that used to be forgotten. Kids came up to her now, not because they knew her face, but because they heard what she did. And when they asked her how she did it, she always said the same thing: "I refuse to believe that silence was safety." The legacy she built wasn't perfect. It was painful. It was costly. But it was real. And in the world she helped shape, that was more than enough. And now, to you, the one listening. Ask yourself this: what would you do if no one believed the truth you carried? Would you hide it? Protect yourself? Or would you risk everything to show the world the cracks in the walls it called justice? Because the story you just heard isn't just about spies and secrets. It's about decisions. The small ones. The hard ones. The ones that don't get applause. The ones that cost more than they reward. And it asks a question you'll carry long after the story fades: when it's your turn to choose between comfort and courage, who will you be? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged what you thought you knew, then stay with us. These are the stories that need to be told. This is Tales of Twist. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Nia's place? Because the truth is still out there, and maybe you're the one meant to bring it to light.